And at number 10, we have a burning statement. Jose Villegas was convicted of murdering his ex-girlfriend, her young son, and her mother 13 years ago, and he was sentenced to be executed. He was also convicted for making terroristic threats to kill women, burglary, and possessing inhalants. His attorney argued that the stabbings weren't intentional because he was mentally ill. Keep in mind that the Supreme Court prohibits the execution of mentally impaired people, but the Supreme Court denied their appeals because they said that previous examinations of Jose Villegas showed no mental impairment. And they also argued that his lawyers had 10 years to bring up his mental impairment, but they didn't until just days before his scheduled execution. So as the medical technician inserted the lethal drug, he said, "It does kind of burn. Goodbye." He then gasped several times, his breathing started to get quieter, and within 1 minute, he stopped moving and his pulse stopped. Up next, number 9, we have an unusual statement. Richard Cobb said these last words before he was declared dead. "Wow, this is great. This is awesome. Thank you, Warden." Well, I think it's safe to say that his final statements was very odd. It seems like he actually was enjoying being executed.
Witnesses looking through the glass in a small confined room. He looked calm, looking up at the ceiling.
I expected him to have some remorse, which I didn't.
He didn't have any.
I didn't have any.
The witnesses in the room were left confused and unfulfilled. It's like he did this on purpose because he didn't want the victim's family to get closure. Richard Cobb actually spent a decade on death row for murdering a man who abducted and later killed during a convenience store robbery. After the drug entered his system, his head hit the pillow and his neck twisted with his mouth wide open. 15 minutes later, he was declared dead. Moving up this list, or down this list, depends on how you see it. At number 8, we have Joshua Bishop. During his final moments alive, he said, "I feel it. I don't know about you guys, but the statement gives me the chills. When I was reading Inmates' last words, a lot of them actually say that they feel the drug entering their body and that they can feel that death is near. That is just something so unsettling about the statements that I cannot explain. On the night on June 24th, 1994, he had spent the night drinking and smoking crack with 2 other people. He tried to steal car keys from Leverett Morrison, who was sleeping at the time, but things didn't go according to plan. Joshua Bishop beat Leverett Morrison to death and dumped his body between 2 trash cans and burned his Jeep. He was arrested within 24 hours after the murder, and he quickly confessed and immediately began to show remorse. However, after the trial, he was convicted and sentenced to die by lethal injection. His lawyers tried to appeal this decision by saying that he is a reformed man and he has turned all of a sudden somehow into a model citizen. They even submitted written statements by the victim's family saying that they didn't want to have him executed, but all of the appeals were denied. A hellish statement makes its way onto this list at number 7. Lavinia Fisher said, "If you have a message and want to get it to hell, give it to me. I'll carry it." Is this real life right now? Well, I guess she knew exactly where she was heading. It wasn't up. It is argued that she is the first woman serial killer in the United States, and she was arrested and sentenced to death by hanging, but she never actually killed anyone. According to the story, Lavinia and her husband ran an inn just outside of Charleston. When a single person checked in, Lavinia would use her charm to gain their trust. Once they felt at ease with her, she would give them a cup of tea that was poisoned. Once the poison entered their body, the person would go to sleep and she would steal their possessions. It was actually her husband that did the stabbings, but as it turns out, she was arrested and hanged in 1820, and it is believed that her spirit still haunts the old city jail. Up next, number 6, we have James Jackson. Before he was executed, he said, "See you all on the other side. Warden murdered me. I am ready to roll. Time to get this party started." James Jackson was not a model citizen, that's for sure. He was a white supremacist who stabbed a 66-year-old black man to death with a sword in New York. He was quickly charged with second-degree murder as a hate crime, and when he was arrested, he told police that he hated black men for at least the past 10 years.
But Jackson allegedly told detectives he had bigger plans. Mr. Jackson regarded the killing as practice prior to going to Times Square square to kill additional black men.
He was motivated by his strong hatred, and he fully intended on killing as many black men as he could. Well, thankfully he was caught and arrested before he was able to cause any more harm. Number 5 brings us over to George Harris, who made a disturbing last statement. He said, "Somebody needs to kill my trial attorney." After he won $500 on a craps game in Kansas, he exchanged his winnings for 2 machine guns, and then he had another man hold on to them for safekeeping. But when George Harris came back for his guns later that night, the man told him that he didn't know where they were, so he shot them dead with a revolver. There was just so many questions left unanswered, like why does one person need 2 machine guns, and who misplaced the deadly weapons? This is all very strange, but George Harris was eventually sentenced to death by lethal injection on September 13th, 2000, and apparently he wasn't happy with his lawyer's performance during the trial. Stephen Woods creeps onto this list at number 4. He was sentenced to the death penalty in Texas after a jury convicted him of capital murders of several drug dealers, even though someone else confessed to the killings. But Texas has an unusual law that allows a defendant to be put to death for a murder that someone else committed. He was given a lethal injection, but before he died, he said these final last words: "You're not about to witness an execution, you're about to witness a murder. I am strapped down for something that Marcus Rhodes did." After his final statement, he took several deep breaths before he stopped moving completely. Can you imagine being killed for a crime that you didn't directly commit? Yes, he was present during the murders, but he never actually killed anyone. Do you guys agree with the death penalty, or do you guys think that it's cruel and an unusual punishment? What if you never killed anyone, but you were still a part of it? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, because I'm really curious. And now number 3, we're going to be talking about Jonathan Green's last words before death. This inmate used his last breath to maintain his innocence of the murder of a 12-year-old girl. He was arrested for abduction, sexual abuse, and strangulation of a young girl whose body was found at his home. His lawyer made several last-ditch efforts to have his death sentence reversed, but none of them were successful. Before he was given the lethal injection, the warden asked him if he had any last words, but he shook his head and said no. But just a few seconds later, he changed his mind and said, "I'm an innocent man. I never killed anyone. Y'all are killing an innocent man." I know that these last words are probably said a lot, but what if they weren't lying? What if they really were innocent? Now that we have better resources and more forensic analysis, it is believed that at least 4.1% of death row inmates would have been exonerated because this DNA evidence wasn't available to them at the time of their conviction. They were given the death penalty when they were actually innocent. And finally, number 1, we have Benny Demps. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection for murdering another inmate before he was killed. He blamed his executioners of butchering him with a needle. He said, "They butchered me back there. I was in a lot of pain. They cut me in the groin. They cut me in the leg. I was bleeding profusely." I'm not really sure what this guy is complaining about, because they were about to kill him. Why does he care about anything at this time? So he also said, "This is not an execution, it is a murder." Apparently the medical technicians cut him several times as they were trying to insert the IV, and because he was just an inmate, they didn't treat him with any dignity or respect. Although he was a convicted murderer, and I don't know, I guess this is up for debate. What do you guys think? Do convicts who are about to be put to sleep, for a crime they committed, should they be treated right? Should they be treated the right way? I don't know. I don't think so. Well, this man is about to die anyway. Is he suffering enough? Should he be treated fairly as a human being up until death? So for his last meal, he ordered barbecue chicken and beef, french fries, salad, Spanish rice, cherry vanilla, and butter pecan ice cream.
Starting off this countdown, we have Jeffrey Dahmer. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of this infamous serial killer. Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal or the Milwaukee Monster, was an American serial killer who murdered and dismembered 17 men and boys from 1878 to 1991. He would pack the victims' body parts into plastic bags and bury them behind his parents' home. Upon searching his home, police found albums full of pictures of body parts, and his place was filled with human remains. Heads were in the fridge and freezer, 2 skulls were on display, and a 57-gallon drum filled with decomposing bodies was found in his room. On top of that, there was evidence that Dahmer would eat some of his victims. On November 28, 1994, he was beaten to death by an inmate. His last words were, "I don't care if I live or die. Go ahead and kill me." Moving on at number 9, we have Robert Alton Harris. Robert Alton Harris was an American kidnapper, thief, and murderer. He was convicted for the murder of 2 boys in San Diego. On April 21, 1992, he was sentenced to death via gas chamber. But first, let's talk about his last meal. This guy went all out. He had KFC, 2 large pizzas, a bag of jelly beans, and a 6-pack of Pepsi. Now, his last words were, "You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everyone dances with the Grim Reaper." This is actually a misquote from the 1991 film Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. Nonetheless, pretty creepy. Making our way down the list at number 8, we have Clarence Ray Allen. Clarence Ray Allen was an American criminal who played a role in killing 3 people. In 1974, Clarence was on trial for the murder of his son's girlfriend. He had 8 witnesses testify against him. And guess what? He hired a hitman to kill those witnesses. The hitman successfully killed 3 of them and then was caught and turned Clarence in. Clarence died by lethal injection on January 17, 2006. His last words were, "Hoka hey, it's a good day to die. Thank you very much, I love you all, goodbye." Wow. In our 7th spot, we have Eileen Wuornos. Eileen Wuornos, often referred to as the Damsel of Death, killed 7 men. She murdered them, robbed them, and then drove home in their cars. Due to this, she was named America's first female serial killer. Now, she does claim that it was all self-defense and that they tried to assault her, but her stories of the events were very inconsistent. In fact, during an interview with a filmmaker, she claims that it was self-defense, but that she couldn't stand being on death row any longer since she had already been there for 10 years, and she just wanted to die, so that's why she confessed to killing the men. On October 9th, 2002, she was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Her last words were a reference from the movie Independence Day. She said, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie Big Mothership and all, I'll be back." Now, people often cut this quote down and say that her last words were just, "I'll be back," but either way, it's pretty creepy and kind of like the Terminator, like, "I'll be back." Moving on at number 6, we have Andre Chikatilo. Andre Chikatilo was a serial killer that confessed to murdering over 50 women. The murders took place from 1978 to 1990. In fact, he's been deemed one of history's sickest serial killers. On February 14th, 1994, he was executed by a gunshot to the head. Just before his death, he said, "Don't blow my brains out, the Japanese want to buy them." And then he was shot and killed. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with Carl Panzram. Charles, or Carl Panzram, was an American serial killer, robber, and arsonist. He claims to have murdered 22 individuals. However, only a handful of them have been proved. In his autobiography that he wrote in prison, he also states that he committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, and arsons. On September 5th, 1930, at the age of 39, Carl was killed by being hung. His last words were, "Hurry up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill 10 men while you're fooling around." In our 4th spot, we have H.H. Holmes. Herman Webster Mudgett, otherwise known as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, or H.H. Holmes, was an American serial killer. In 1886, he moved to Chicago and got a job as a pharmacist under the name Dr. H.H. Holmes. However, he was killing people in order to steal their properties. He also got his employees to write him down as a beneficiary so that he would get all the money after he killed them. And then he would sell the bodies of his victims to medical schools. On top of that, he owned a house that was referred to as the Murder Castle. Basically, his home had secret passages, trapdoors, soundproof rooms, gas chambers, and a kiln to cremate the bodies. Eventually, he admitted to 27 murders. However, only 9 were confirmed. Yet, officials believe he had killed closer to 200 individuals. On May 7th, 1896, he was hung. His last words were, "Take your time. don't bungle it. Moving on to number 3, we have George Engel. George Engel was an anarchist and con artist. He was thought to be involved in the 1886 bombing in Haymarket Square. Although the night of the bombing, Engel was home, he was arrested and charged with conspiracy in the bombing. He was hung on November 11th, 1887. Just before being hung, he said, "Hurrah for anarchy! This is the happiest moment of my life." In our second spot, we have Tom Ketchum. Tom Ketchum, otherwise known as Black Jack, was a famous cowboy that later turned into an outlaw. He committed several robberies and crimes. In 1901, he was caught after a failed train robbery. Looks like they did catch him. Get it? I know, it's bad. While attempting to rob the train, he was shot in the arm and later captured by the police. On April 26, 1901, he was sentenced to death by hanging. His last words were, "I'll be in hell before you start breakfast, boys. Let her rip." Pretty scary. But that's not the worst part. Apparently, the hanging didn't go according to plan. The night before, the executioner tested the rope with a 200-pound sandbag, but then forgot to remove it. So when they went to hang Ketchum, this caused his entire head to just be decapitated. His body then fell to the floor and apparently remained upright on its feet for quite some time. And in our number 1 spot, we have the Dusseldorf Vampire. Peter Kürten, also known as the Dusseldorf Vampire or the Dusseldorf Monster, was a German serial killer. He was responsible for the deaths of around 60 people. And in one case, he actually drank the blood of one of his victims. Hence why they call him the vampire. On July 2nd, 1931, Peter was sentenced to death by the guillotine. But just before he was beheaded, he said this, "Tell me, after my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." Yeah, can you see why he's number 1 on the list? That is probably one of the creepiest things I have ever heard.
Will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures.
Starting things off, number 10, we have Robert Elton Harris. He said, "You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everyone dances with the Grim Reaper." He was arrested on July 5th of 1978 when him and his brother hijacked a car with 2 teenage boys in it. They ordered them to drive to a remote location where their brothers brutally murdered them, and then they used the vehicle as a getaway car when they robbed a San Diego bank. Robert Harris was arrested just 1 hour after the robbery, and he was charged with murder and auto theft, kidnapping, burglary, and bank robbery. One of the arresting officers was the father of one of the murdered boys, but he didn't realize that the victim was his son until later. He wasn't even able to recognize his son's face. That's how violent the murder was. Robert Harris was sentenced to death in 1979. After many appeals, he was finally executed in San Quentin's gas chamber on April 21st of 1992. Moving up this list with George Engel in at number 9. He was an anarchist who didn't like to follow any sort of rules or regulations. He was involved with a lot of activism and protests in the Chicago area. A protest bombing took place in Haymarket Square in Chicago that resulted in the death of 7 police officers, 4 civilians, and a lot of other people who were seriously injured. George Engel was actually at home playing cards while this riot broke out, and he was arrested the next day and charged with conspiracy in the bombings. He was convicted and sentenced to hanging, but before he took his last breath, he said, "Hurrah for anarchy. This is the happiest moment of my life." Roger Keith Coleman makes his last statement in at number 8. His case gained nationwide attention and major controversy because he maintained his innocence the whole time during his conviction and even right before he was executed. During his final last words, he said, "An innocent man is going to be murdered tonight. When my innocence is proven, I hope Americans will realize the injustice of the death penalty as all other civilized countries have." He was convicted in Virginia for assaulting and murdering his sister-in-law on the day that he has been laid off from work. After his death, the DNA evidence was reanalyzed, and in January 2006, the governor announced that the testing of the DNA evidence has conclusively proven that he was guilty of the crime. Okay, that's great and all, but why don't you think you should have done 1,000 tests on the DNA before you executed him? It makes no sense. What if the DNA evidence proved that he wasn't guilty? What would the press conference look like then? Oops, we made a massive mistake and killed an innocent man. My bad. And now at number 7, we have Timothy McVeigh. He infamously said, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." If you guys remember, he was the one behind the Oklahoma City bombing, which killed 168 people and injured over 680 others. This bombing is actually the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in the United States. His execution date was set for June 11, 2001, and he made a request to have it publicly televised, but this motion was denied. He invited a composer to perform classical music on the night of his execution, and he requested to have a Catholic chaplain. He also requested 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream as his last meal. He was executed by lethal injection, and his wait to be executed was way shorter than most inmates waiting on death row. He only spent about 4 years on death row, while most inmates spend an average of 15 years. The infamous Jeffrey Dahmer is next up at number 6. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms for murdering 17 men and boys in the Milwaukee area, and this is between 1978 and 1991. He was also heavily into necrophilia, and he kept his victims' body parts in the freezer so that he can just eat them later. The interesting part of this story is that Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't given the death penalty. His inmate actually beat him to death because he said that Jeffrey Dahmer was a sick and creepy man. And yeah, he was. He used to make this person food look like human body parts, and he would cover them in ketchup to resemble blood. So according to Jeffrey Dahmer's murderer, his last words were, "I don't care if I live or die, go ahead and kill me." And now at number 5, we have Tom Blackjack Ketchum. He was an outlawed cowboy who murdered someone in 1895. After that, his gang fled to New Mexico, where they committed more robberies before he was captured during an unsuccessful attempt to rob a train. He was quickly arrested, put on trial, found guilty, and sentenced to death by hanging. When his execution date arrived, it was the biggest public display in the area because he was the first person to be hanged for a train robbery in New Mexico. However, things didn't go as smoothly as they hoped. Before he was hanged, he said this, "I'll be in hell before you start breakfast, boys, let her rip." And right after that, he said the rope completely decapitated him, and it is said that his headless body landed on its feet and stayed standing upright for quite some time. Aileen Wuornos is up next at number 3. Aileen had a terrible childhood that was full of abuse and abandonment, so it's almost no surprise that she went on a killing rampage that would define her as America's most infamous female serial killer. She worked as a prostitute, and she killed 7 men that picked her up along the highway. Aileen said that all of her murderers were out of self-defense, but she was also convicted and sentenced to death for 6 of the murders. She was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002, but before she died, she said this, "I just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June the 6th. Like the movie, a big mothership of all, I'll be back." I don't even know what this even means, but I am pretty scared. And June 6th, what happens on June 6th? Carl Panzram's last words makes it onto this list at number 2. You probably don't recognize his name, but he is actually known as one of the most sadistic American serial killers of all time. He had more than a dozen aliases, and no one knew anything about what he has done for years until he was captured in November 1928. Before his death, he confessed to killing 21 people and sexually harming 1,000 males. Is this real life right now? And right before he was hanged, he said, "In my lifetime, I have murdered 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I have committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings." That is just sickening, and for all those reasons, I'm not the least bit sorry for this guy. The Vampire of Dusseldorf falls onto our list at number 1. He is known as a vampire because he would occasionally attempt to drink the blood from his victims' wounds while they were still alive. But eventually he was arrested and sentenced to death by beheading because he committed a series of murders and sexual assaults. It is confirmed that he murdered at least 9 people, but the police suspected that he brutally murdered a lot more people. So one evening before his death, he ordered a Wiener Schnitzel, a bottle of white wine, and fried potatoes, and the next morning morning he was taken to the guillotine to have his head chopped off. But before he left this world, he made one last scary statement that probably haunted the people that were at his execution. He said, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my head? That would be a pleasure to end all pleasures." I mean, yeah, after hearing that, I'm definitely gonna have nightmares, and if that wasn't enough, his mummified head is on display right now in a Wisconsin museum after doctors tried to cut it open to find reasons behind his evil. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.